So welcome, good afternoon. This is the final session of this year's Carer Knowledge Exchange Research Incubator. My name is Sarah Judd-Lamb. I'm the Executive Manager, Policy Development and Research here at Carers New South Wales and part of the Carer Knowledge Exchange project. I would like to start this session by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that everyone is joining from today. Here in North Sydney, where most of our tech team is based, we are on Gurrugal land, but I want to extend my respect to elders past and present from this land and the many lands that are most likely represented by our facilitators, panelists and attendees today. If you would like to add the land that you're on in the chat, you're welcome to do so we can see the range of lands that people are from today. We also want to acknowledge National Reconciliation Week that started yesterday. And this morning we had a wonderful session with First Nations carers hearing about their experiences and what that means for research and practice. So if you missed that one this morning, we encourage you to catch up with the recording. And this session also will be recorded. Just briefly about the Carer Knowledge Exchange before we meet our panelists today. So if you're not aware of the project, it's a research translation project that Carers New South Wales leads with New South Wales government funding that aims to connect research to practice to improve outcomes for all carers. I haven't said much about it on the slide there, but if you're new to the project, please do check out the website that's there and should be going in the chat. To have a look at what the project offers, and please do connect with updates for the project. Just a little bit on the session today. So developments in young carer research is our last session this afternoon. Young carers are children and young people aged 25 years and under who help to support a family member or friend living with disability, mental illness, drug or alcohol dependency, chronic condition, terminal illness, or who is aging or frail. So Carers New South Wales takes a special interest in young carers because of the particular challenges that they can experience with being identified, being recognised and receiving timely support. And also because of the significant ongoing impacts of caring on young people's education, employment and wellbeing. So we do a number of initiatives in this space. We're very interested in young carers from a research perspective, and we're really proud to be bringing together some expert and cutting edge voices today who are working on this very important topic as well. And just to sort of touch on, I guess, where you might find more information about young carers from a practice perspective, if that's something that is of interest to you. Carers New South Wales hosts all of our information for young carers and about young carers on our Young Carer Hub, which launched about this time last year. So there's just a screenshot of that on the slide for you there. And I think the link will go in the chat. But please do check out our Young Carer Hub if you are a young carer, or if you have a young carer in your household, or if you are a service provider or an educator that wants to know how better to support young carers. We have a range of initiatives that you can get involved with, a number of resources, so please do check that out. The other sort of housekeeping thing I should note before we get started is that we recognise that we have a number of different carers, including young carers, join these sessions. Sometimes some of the topics can be a little close to home. If you are a carer that feels distressed or needs support, we will be sharing wellbeing information throughout the session in the chat, but also we have a wellbeing officer on call that's in a virtual room that you're welcome to join and have a chat with if at any time you need to step out and do that. So that information will be in the chat, and a big thank you to our support team. So by way of starting today's discussion, those of you that registered and saw our promotional material will see that we had originally had our wonderful young carer advocate Chiara Roche as facilitator for today's session. Chiara is a member of the Carers New South Wales Young Carer Advisory Group and also the New South Wales Ministerial Carers Advisory Council, and she's also involved in a lot of research as well. Unfortunately, Chiara has had to step away from this session due to unplanned personal circumstances, and she shares her sincere apologies for not being able to be part of this discussion, but she has very much been involved in the development of this panel and the questions, so she's able to participate in that way. We're sorry we can't introduce you to her today. She's a wonderful advocate. We were able to get one of our other Young Carer Advisory Group members, Luke Randall, to help us with the session in Kiara's absence. Unfortunately, he has work commitments at this time, so while he can't facilitate, we asked Luke if he could record a few words to kick off our session from a young carer's perspective. So he's done that for us, which is fantastic. So it's not the same as a live facilitator, but it's very important to us that we have young carer voices in this session. Luke's not the only young carer voice we will have. We'll also have a couple of other people with recent lived experience of young caring talking in our panel today. But we wanted to start off with Luke, who we will hear from briefly in video form.
Hey everyone, my name is Luke. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm 24 years old and I've been in a young carer role for over 13 years. I've cared for various people, so I've cared for my mum who has complex chronic medical conditions, as well as my younger brother who has epilepsy, early onset Parkinson's and an intellectual disability. I'm no longer in a caring role for my mum, but I'm still heavily involved in a caring and support capacity for my younger brother. And that is going to be ongoing for the foreseeable future. In terms of actually structuring the research, I'm going to geek out just a little bit and use my social work theories to guide this a little bit. So using a strength-based lens allows us to use our knowledge and existing skills and then build upon them to help build resilience and capacity. Minority stress theory, I won't go into it because I don't have time. But it does help provide the context of a young carer or any minority group. It allows researchers to have a greater understanding of the young carer experience and how it's very complex. And again, I'll use the word I used before, very nuanced. It changes and it's different for every young carer. What I do is not the same as what someone else will do in their caring role, because the person they care for is also different. So of course, the caring role will also be different and the support they need will be different. That is really the two key points I wanted to put within research. There is not a lot out there, unfortunately. I really do want to get into the research space myself. I'm not good with words, but it is something I hope to, consult and help with in the future and continue to do things like this. So hopefully this can provide some context into my experience as both a young carer and a mental health clinician in the field today.
And that's a big thank you to Luke for recording those thoughts at short notice. Luke, along with other members of our Young Carer Advisory Group and Carers New South Wales Carer Representative Program, share their experiences a lot as part of these kinds of sessions. And a number of them are really interested in research from a professional perspective and working in that space, which is also fantastic. So I now have the privilege of introducing our guest panelists. Luke's on that list as well, because you just heard from him. And all of our panelists today have special expertise in understanding and raising awareness of young carers' experiences from a whole range of perspectives. Many of them draw on their lived experience as well as their professional experience. All of them are really interested in data and what the research tells us about young carers' experiences. And we're hoping that they will bring you today an up-to-date picture of where young carer research is at, where it's headed, and share their findings with you and some policy recommendations as well for how we can apply that research. So we have Kelly Chan on today, who is sharing her experiences as a former young carer. We also have Associate Professor Myra Hamilton from the University of Sydney, Professor Ben Edwards from the Australian National University, Ludmilla Fleitas Alfonso from the University of Melbourne, Lucy Snowball from Raise Foundation, and we have Owen Walker as well, who is going to share a brief recorded presentation, and he's a clinical psychologist and also a former young carer. So I am not going to go into detail introducing everybody's work because there's too much to mention. So I've left that to our panelists to, I guess, contextualise as they answer the questions today, and they might share some additional information in the chat as well about their work. So before we get into the live discussion, One of our panelists, Owen Walker, is in the UK at the moment, where it's the middle of the night. So we didn't demand that he join live, but Owen's done a number of interesting literature studies that draw on young carers, and he recorded a brief presentation for us about his work in clinical psychology, and also mentions his own experience as a former young carer. So we're going to share another short video from Owen, and then we're going to have our panelists kick off the formal questions. So over to our tech team for Owen's video.
Hi everyone, my name is Owen. I'm a clinical psychologist and a former young carer, and today I'll be talking about the research that I published as part of my doctorate. So one of the studies that we published was a systematic literature review, which essentially means that you collect a bunch of research that other people have published, and you group it all together and develop a story from it, which is what we've done here, and we've split that into 3 sections. So the first looks into what it's like to become a young carer, and I think the main 2 points to take away from this are that young people are often essentially born into the role in the sense that they can't actually identify a beginning point. It's the only thing they've ever known. And the other thing to be aware of is that they are often, at least in the young carer families that present to research teams and support services, they are often experiencing a range of challenges within the family that might be socioeconomic status related or ethnicity related or drug and alcohol addiction or mental health needs or that sort of thing. And so the young care experience and the demands of providing care, and plus often these additional challenges, can lead to a serious sense of disconnect at the individual young carer level and at the broader family level. So the individual young carer is often disconnected from their peers because they really are trying to juggle their significant care responsibility in the home, and the family can often be disconnected because they are also juggling the demands of the care recipient, but also there may sometimes be reluctance to access support services due to either not knowing about them or a sense of shame and stigma that maybe they might be judged by not meeting the needs of their family. And all of this can lead to some pretty significant negative outcomes, so social isolation and impairment across a range of domains. But psychologically, anxiety and depression are quite prominent in young carers who grow up in families where their personal needs often are not prioritized because the needs of the care recipient are sort of paramount, which can lead to a bit of a conflict in the young carer's identity development because they're unsure what their place is in the family. You know, they're providing high levels of care and support and they're contributing a lot, but often they're kind of overlooked as a secondary priority, or at least that's the perception. But it's not all negative. One of our studies looked into the positives of young carers. So we had the opportunity to sit down with a bunch of young carers and hear their stories, and they told us some pretty profound stories of what it's like to grow up as a young carer. And from that, some really powerful positives came out. And so maturity and independence were quite common. Naturally, children who grow up having a higher level of responsibility develop a better capacity to do things for themselves, emotionally and functionally. But empathy was another one that came out, and I think that's exemplified by the quote at the bottom there quite well. But one interesting finding that we found was vocational congruence, which is essentially just a fancy way of saying that a lot of young carers grew up and used their skills and life experience in a way to meaningfully connect with their work. So often they became healthcare workers or teachers or that sort of thing. And obviously resilience comes from persevering through challenge and improving your capacity to bounce back from stresses and that sort of thing. So what do we do with this information? Well, I think obviously increased awareness is important, but also awareness of the diversity of the young carer experience. So we can get better at actually looking at the individual and tailoring an intervention to that individual. And I think psychologically, as I've sort of alluded to, there's the role of identity and the role that the caring aspect in particular plays in the development of an identity is massive and cannot be understated. And I think supporting young people to kind of understand their role, understand who they are, and understand the value that they can contribute to themselves, the family, and the broader society is going to be a really important aspect of helping young carers come out of the caring experience strong and healthy. All right, that's it from me. These are the 3 studies that I've published. The second one is available open access, which means you can Google it and have a read, but the other 2 are locked behind sort of paywalls in scientific journals. So if you can't access them, I'm more than happy to share them. And they're my co-authors down the bottom there. All right, thank you.
So a big thank you to Owen, where it's currently very early hours of the morning, for taking the time to contribute that. And what a great way to kick off our discussion, I guess, in framing the big picture of some of the things that we know about young carers, the positives, the challenges, but also some interesting themes that Owen picked up as well as Luke around the diversity of young carers and not considering that it's a one-size-fits-all approach. So I think that's a really great grounding for our discussion. And I wanted to pass firstly to Myra. We've heard a little bit about young carers by way of introduction. How common is caring among children and young people, and what are some of the challenges that we have accurately counting that?
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, look, we do have some challenges with the data that exists. So, there are some caveats when we talk about prevalence of caring at a young age. Certainly in the national data collected by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, so for example, the Survey of Disability, Ageing and Carers, the data it sits at around says that caring at a young age sits at around 4 or 5%. But we think this is likely to be an underestimate because it relies on parents reporting whether or not children in the family are caring. And also because many parents don't think of the children's activities as care. Caring is thought of as a normal part of family life, people in the family supporting each other and don't think about it as care as such. We also know that many parents are reluctant to report that there is a young carer in the family because, as Owen said, parents are fearful of stigma, and also because parents have reported to us that they're concerned about unwanted intervention from social services if they report that there's a carer in the family. So we think that the prevalence is likely to be a lot higher. One of the surveys that we've done some years ago was a survey of school-aged children, aged 9 to 14 years, and that suggested that around 9% of young people reported being young carers. We think this is likely to be a more accurate estimate, first because it asks young carers themselves or children themselves rather than asking adults, but also because we phrase the question in a way that didn't ask, are you a young carer, but asked them about whether there are extra tasks they do around the house and provided examples. So commonly people talk about 1 in 10. 1 in 20, members of a classroom are young carers, but we think it's more likely to be 1 in 10. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Myra. And Ben, how has your work addressed some of the challenges of counting young?
Thanks, Sarah. Can people hear me okay? Yep.
Yep.
So I've also been involved in a number of large-scale surveys. So most of my work's around large-scale population surveys, primarily longitudinal surveys where people were followed over time. And our estimates are also quite varied as well, Myra. So we've just got data from a national survey of students who finished year 12 last year. And when they were in year 11, we asked them about whether they were young carers or not, and we continue to ask them. And the latest data, which was from year 11, suggests that about 15%, just under 15% of young people are reporting being a young carer. But it does vary quite a lot depending on how you measure it, the intensity of the caring arrangements, whether there's a person with a disability or who's frail age or chronic illness in the household. That makes a very big difference in terms of reporting. And as the first academic speaker put so eloquently, a lot of young people don't even really recognize that what they do on a routine, general, day-to-day basis is caring. So there's, and we find also that the implications of caring does vary quite considerably in terms of life outcomes and educational outcomes, which I'll touch on later, depending on how you define it as well. So it is a real challenge. My sort of default, I guess, when thinking about young people is that if there is a person with a disability or significant care needs in a household, they're going to be doing some form of caring, and they are a young carer, regardless of whether or not they self-identify. So that's sort of my default. And whether that means that there's higher prevalence rates or not, from the purposes of providing additional services and supports and thinking about the needs of the young person, and also the parents themselves, I think that's probably a quite valuable way to think about it.
That's great. Thanks, Ben. And that's a good segue to our next question of Lucy. So looking at kind of the service environment, how can the questions that children and young people are asked about caring impact whether or not they're counted?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I'm so pleased to be part of this discussion. Hello, everyone out there listening. So RAISE is a national youth mentoring organisation. We deliver mentoring programs for young people in early high school. So they're sort of between about 12 and 15, either at school or online. And we've been collecting data every year that we've been running our programs for 16 years now. And we do evaluation surveys for everyone in our program. And we ask a range of questions, including caring responsibilities. And a few years ago, 2022, we shifted from quite a simple question, are you a carer, to the more specific, do you help look after a family member or friend due to disability, health condition, or mental illness? And we changed our question based on the support and the advice of Carers New South Wales. So 2022 compared to the year before, 2021, we saw the proportion of young people identifying as being a carer going from 1 in 9, 2021, to 1 in 3 in 2022. And since then, our proportion has remained consistently over 30%. And actually this year, it's sitting at just under 1 in 2. And so by having that sort of visibility over young carers in our program, we've also further refined the kinds of questions that we ask. So this year, for example, we have asked about the type of caring. So we've separated between caring for family, friends, or both. We've also asked about the impact that this has on school activities, so participating in school activities, specifically about caring. So this gives us a more nuanced picture of what is happening for the young people in our programs. So I guess for us, asking the right questions and continuing to build on these questions by adding nuance means that young carers become more visible. We understand more about them and how to support them. But most importantly, we can amplify their voices so that their experience and strengths can be part of their solutions, the solutions that we can design.
That's great. Thanks, Lucy. And so what we've heard from all of you is, that it really depends on what conditions you include or not include in who's being cared for, what relationships you include, and layered on top of all the other challenges of counting young carers. This is why we have some difficulties. And I know we've recently chatted with Ray's Foundation about the inclusion of friends, for example, but in the spike in young people's mental health challenges, particularly since COVID, we're seeing far more reliance on peers in those situations, and that can be quite serious. So I think it's also really exciting to have opportunities to capture that friend element, where I think a lot of our data sources have a family focus. So it's been great to work with Rays and get a bit more of a understanding about the young carers in their groups. And I guess that transitions well to our next question too, because one thing I think that we're aware of is that young carers often overlap with other groups that might be better identified. And so I wanted to pass back to you, Ben, and ask, how might young carers be hidden among other disadvantaged population groups, and what implications does this have for policy?
Yeah, sure. So thanks very much, Sarah. So some of the work that I'm doing at the moment is sort of in the higher education space. And in that particular space, measurement of equity groups or groups that are worthy of additional supports is a real focus, and also it's very much the target for education policy and support. So whether you're in that set of particular groups or not in that set of particular groups. Now, we know with young carers, they tend to be growing up in families where there is a disability or frail age in the household. Therefore, there usually is higher levels of financial disadvantage. So, and in fact, the equity groups in this sort of higher education space are really focused around lower socioeconomic status, those who have a disability, so the student who has a disability, and we know that young carers are more likely to also have a disability. So, in generation, which is the survey that I was mentioning before, a larger proportion of young carers those who identify as young carers also have a disability. Those who are not in regional areas are also one of the foci of equity groups. Indigenous students who come from an Indigenous background are also one of the equity groups, and we know that young carers are also more likely to be from having an Indigenous background as well. So that all these sorts of things are sort of overlapping, but there's no real national collection in schools of whether a young person's a young carer. And so consequently, there's no real capacity to be able to provide additional support. I know you've heard from one of my PhD students Azadeh on Monday talking about higher education challenges and completions of carers in the university system. But more broadly, we can see that there's implications for that too. So I guess there's this challenge, I guess, about the extent to which the young carers is recognised and measured. And that Myra spoke to this issue around how do you accurately assess, young carers, and government doesn't want, if there is 1 in 2 young people who are a carer, are they going to be providing support? So there is this issue around intensity, but there is this fundamental opportunity, I think, in the education policy area to be thinking about young carers as another group. And we know that, as discussed earlier, those young carers do have some challenges in terms of fully engaging in education, both in school, but also at university.
That's great. Thanks, Ben. And Azadeh's presentation was part of our Day 1 Early Career Research Forum, which was also recorded in live stream and will be part of the sessions that are shared. There's a lot of up and coming researchers doing some great work here, including in the young carer space. And Lucy, I wanted to throw back to you based on Ben's comments. From your sort of service delivery and evaluation perspective, how do you see caring intersect with other forms of disadvantage in your work, and what supports can help?
Thank you. Yes, we know that young carers who join our program have many strengths. I think Owen talked to many of those before as well, but we do see that many face challenges and disadvantages. So Ben's talked about a few of those intersections. We also look at obviously what's happening for them at school. And for our young carers in our program, 1/3 of them are identifying as having a mental health condition. Many of our young carers struggle with feeling like they belong at school and fitting in with other students around them. And more than 4 in 5 young carers are experiencing loneliness, with half of them feeling lonely often or always. And as I mentioned before, we're starting to ask them about that impact of caring responsibilities on their ability to engage in school activities. And we found this year that 1/3 of them are saying that that impact is most or all the time. So for us, we know that young carers are joining our program for someone to listen to them, to help them get through school and to provide support and guidance. And we really know, obviously, as a mentoring program, that providing them with a trusted adult role model like a mentor and creating a safe space for them can create a range of positive impacts. And as Owen said earlier, supports that are individualised and tailored to the young carer, so not a one-size-fits-all approach. And mentoring is obviously a real opportunity to build a program around young people. For us, the most pronounced impacts that we see, so the best sort of improvements that we see for young people in our program are the ability to ask for help, to look to the future and hope for the future, and set goals, to really feel like they belong at school and with their peers, and improve coping skills and self-confidence. We ran a focus group just at the end of, actually at the beginning of this term, with a group of young carers, and we asked them about how they feel a program like mentoring or an individualised program can be of help to them. And these are some of the things that they told us. So a program like this gives them a break, helps them gain more respect, helps them to focus on themselves, helps them to realise what they need, connects them with resources. And also having someone who shares a similar experience to them makes them feel like they're not alone and makes them feel like they're supported. So I think for us overall, all of this just shows us how important it is to listen to young carers and ensure that their voices are included in research, but also that their voices are included in the design of programs that are being built to support them.
Thanks for that, Lucy. And it makes me think as well of our first session in yesterday's day 2 of the Research Incubator. We heard from some international speakers about evaluating carer support interventions. And one of our speakers, Joe Gogler from University of Minnesota, his perspective, and he's an implementation scientist in gerontology, and he was saying we need to flip research to practice on its head, in that often actually through practice is how we can get innovative research findings to find out what interventions work for young carers. So, it's important to have the top-down research to practice, but it's also really important to have these innovative programs well evaluated. And the Raise Foundation is a great example of that, trying and testing things and collecting data to really show what's helping. So it's great to hear both sides in this conversation as well. And moving now to Ludmilla, so your work has focused on looking at the impacts of caring on young people's mental health, and what that means for policy and practice. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for having me here. So my team examines the mental health outcomes of young carers in Australia. We use multiple surveys from Australia to do this, including HILDA and LSAC. Basically, what we do is we use longitudinal data using multiple points, multiple data points, and we measure caring at one time point and then mental health at a later one. What we found was that the mental health of young people is worse when they are caring. This is comparing young people who, when they are carers and when they are not carers. So their mental health, we observe worsening mental health after they start caring. And we also observe that the mental health of young carers is worse than their non-caring peers, even 4 years after caring had started. And this means that there are some short and long-term effects of caring in young people in terms of their mental health. And the way we interpret these findings is, and now that I'm working in the disability space, it's just that in no way we are saying caring or people with caring needs are a burden, but we live in a system that is not really compatible with caring, that create a lot of stressors, especially for young people who have so many commitments outside of caring. And so we need to figure out a way to support their mental health, especially in those young people who have intense caring responsibilities. We are also starting to look at suicide as an outcome, and we use the census 2011 in a recent paper that we are working on to identify young people who are carers, and we follow about 2 million young people and for about 9 years, and we found that the risk of suicide is higher among young carers than it is among their non-caring peers. And gladly, recently, the National Care Strategy does identify carers as a group who is at risk of suicide. But focusing on young people, we know there are so many programs now that are working on suicide prevention for young people, but they do not specifically focus on young carers. And I think that's an area of future work for policy.
Thanks so much for that, Ludmilla. And it's always confronting hearing about those challenges, and particularly on an individual level. So we've put that support information in the chat because we recognise that that often intersects with people's lived experience. But it's also so important that we recognise it and we look at this data. And as I know we've chatted with our panellists about and with other young carers about, recognising the positives and the strengths of caring as a young person is important. But in order to get the kind of system change and service support that we need for young carers, we do need to really understand the extent of some of the challenges that young carers experience. So thanks to your team for that fantastic work, delving into that data and for bringing that to light. And also another shameless plug for one of yesterday's sessions. We had actually 2 sessions yesterday on carer data, but we had session 3 was on linked data sets. So people that have an interest in that area and I guess some of the opportunities to look at carers' experiences in those data sets might also be interested in that session. So all of the sessions from this event will be are being recorded and will be shared. Moving to, I guess, another area that we know that there are some challenges, and we've heard Myra and Lucy and Ben touch on this already, is around educational outcomes. So Ben, could you tell us what trends or insights we can see in some of the national data sets about the impacts of caring on education?
Yeah, sure, Sarah. So most of my work in this space has been using LSAC data from the longitudinal study of Australian children, and also a more recent cohort study generation, which I've put up a link in the chat. So I'll just touch on one thing about mental health first before we start. So we've got a measure of psychological distress in generation for wave 3, which hasn't been released yet. But what we do find is 2 things. So one, this cohort had the cohort who is just finished year 12. So in 2024, have much higher levels of mental health, psychological distress than previous cohorts. So we're talking about almost 28, 29% of young people who are not carers have clinically significant levels of mental health. And that's about 10 percentage points higher than other youth cohorts. So the experience of the pandemic seems to have really, and potentially other factors, seems to really undermine young people's mental health generally. And for young carers themselves, perhaps somewhat more so. So they're 5 percentage points higher in terms of their mental health problems. So just to sort of frame that. And these are students who are going through year 12 as well. So it's a stressful period as well. So we sort of need to keep that into account, but nonetheless, it's a significant challenge. And as you mentioned previously, Sarah, just the caring responsibility of peer caring alone is a challenge. In terms of trends, in terms of national data sets, in terms of educational outcomes, what we can see, and this is primarily from the LSAC data that we've done, is there's linked data for the NAPLAN, which is literacy and numeracy data. And what we see is that there are quite significant gaps between young carers and those who are not caring at all. There is a gradient depending on the intensity of caring. So if you're caring more than a certain number of hours per week, then the NAPLAN data seems to be worse and tends to be even worse for boys versus girls. In the NAPLAN, in the LSAC data, we're talking about, depending on which outcome you're looking at, between 1 and 2 years difference in terms of numeracy or literacy skills for boys or girls, for those who are carers versus not carers. So that's at that sort of NAPLAN end. And so that's really quite significant challenge for young people in terms of thinking about their life outcomes. And as I mentioned previously, Azadeh's presentation speaks to higher education outcomes. So if young carers do make it to university, then they are then they are less likely to complete, but it's not so great. So really where I think the challenges lie is really in the schooling system primarily. In terms of what young people really want to do, young carers, a large chunk of them want to go to university just like their peers. So 55% of young people in year 12 who are young carers are saying that they want to go to university, or they want to go to TAFE, about 12%, or they want to have an apprenticeship after they finish school, about 16%. So the aspirations are the same, the challenges are just a bit different. And so those challenges in that early state, in those sort of middle years of schooling, is a really great thing. Parents' capacity to support as well during those school years, reading to kids, providing a further enrichment in terms of extracurricular activities, those sorts of things seem to be playing out as being an important and are very much tied to financial constraints of the family, and also the time constraints really of having a person with a disability or frail age in the household. So there are real sort of challenges in that space, but certainly in terms of the national assessments and the linked data in LSAC, there seems to be young carers seem to have additional challenges in terms of those sort of national assessments.
Thanks for that, Ben. And something I realised I didn't include in our chat moderator's notes, but we'll put in the chat, is we're throwing around some of the big data set names here and some acronyms, which not everyone may be familiar with. I'm just going to share a resource that the Carer Knowledge Exchange has published on Australian carer data sources. So if anyone today is listening and wondering what those acronyms are or how to access them, this is just a sort of growing log we have of different data sets, and the ones that have been mentioned today are all mentioned on here, Hilda and LSAC, and they're sort of some of the sort of, I guess, benefits, constraints. It's something we're building on too, so if there's things that are missing, please do let us know, but please check that out if that's of interest. As I mentioned as well, there's some recordings from yesterday that we'll share around sort of carer data literacy, which is something the Carer Knowledge Exchange is trying to build as well in the services and policy space. We've looked at sort of higher education and some of the national data around education. Myra, you mentioned earlier, you've also done some work in schools and looked at a survey there. What has your work identified as some of the key educational impacts of caring while at school, and what changes are needed to better support young carers at school?
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, look, the projects that we've done, so we've done several projects, and one of them was a large school-based survey, and we've also done a bunch of qualitative work talking to young carers about their experiences, and we do tend to hear similar themes. We hear from young carers that they have difficulty concentrating at school because they're worried about people at home. We hear that sometimes they're late or they miss school because things come up in the home environment that makes it difficult to get to school, or they need to leave school early. We hear that it's more difficult for them to do their homework, and our survey found that young carers were 30% less likely to report being able to do homework daily. We also hear that young carers are often unable to participate in school-related extracurricular activities, and therefore miss out on all of those really important social and emotional benefits that come from participating in those activities. And these things are compounded by, as Ben said, many young carers live in under-resourced families or socioeconomically disadvantaged families, which just compound some of the challenges that they experience in the school environment. And so this affects, we've found through our survey data, young carers' overall enjoyment of and engagement in school. And so in our national study of young people aged 9 to 14 years, young carers reported lower levels of engagement in school and lower levels of enjoyment of school. And coupled with this, young carers often tell us they feel very unsupported in the school environment. So they experience a lot of stigma associated both with ideas about disability and chronic illness, but also with ideas about care and caring. Most report not having a teacher who knows about their care responsibilities, so they report feeling very lonely and isolated in their caring role at school. And we hear that school policies are often inflexible And so young carers aren't having their needs met in the school environment. So for example, one of the things we hear is that it really helps young carers at school if they can make a phone call home at lunchtime, or have a space throughout the day, a quiet space where they can make a call to check in on a family member at home. But the school's no device during the day policies have meant that they haven't been able to do that. And as a consequence, they're so worried it really affects their learning during the day. So that's, something quite small and tangible that it wouldn't take much for schools to do to accommodate in their policies. And so it's not a surprise, I suppose, given all of these challenges that young carers are experiencing at school, that we see the results that Ben was talking about with lower literacy and numeracy levels. We've also seen that young carers are less likely to complete year 12. And as Ben said, many young carers aspire to go to university. We found that young carers often tell us that they adjust their university aspirations and intentions so that they're able to continue providing care for a family member. So doing things like picking a university close to home, studying part-time, deliberately picking courses that don't include a kind of a prolonged practical component that would be really difficult to juggle. So we've made a bunch of recommendations, mostly school focused, things like, make school policies more adaptable so that they meet young carers' needs, give young carers more flexibility in how they do their homework and assignments, provide quiet spaces at school where they can do some of these things at school, and access to digital technologies at school that they might not have access to at home, and really invest in creating a more stigma-free environment, not just kind of in an extracurricular sense, but really embed understanding of disability and chronic illness within the school curriculum, so that the whole school, students and teachers, are more understanding and aware of the issues.
Thanks for that, Myra. And it's great to see, all of you speaking to some really practical steps to address some of the challenges that we've seen in the research. And even though Carers New South Wales does a biennial national survey, and we have a young carer cohort as part of that, it's by no means as representative as some of the surveys that Myra and Ben particularly are talking about, and Ludmilla. But on the topic of whether teachers were aware of the 85% of our young care respondents who had cared for someone while at school, only 49% had teachers who knew about their caring role, and of those, only 21% received extra support while at school. So I think it just kind of reflects or sort of mirrors the evidence that you're talking about. And the other thing as well that we had discussed with Chiara in preparing for this session, even though she's not able to speak to it today, was how often, the educational impacts are really pronounced, but then there's also a lot of young carers that actually do well educationally, and sometimes they aren't picked up, but there might be also impacts on their mental health and sort of future trajectory, even if their grades aren't causing concern. So I think that's also another interesting thing to think about. There's educational impacts, there's mental health impacts, but as Chiara puts really well, sometimes you aren't identified as a young carer until there's a symptom that's a problem. And so we really need to work on identifying young carers. Actually, it's a demographic group, like Ben was speaking to earlier, so that we can look at prevention and early intervention around some of these challenges that we know can emerge. So we've heard a lot about we've heard about education, we've heard about health and some of the policy implications of some of these findings. I mentioned before, understanding the challenges is really important. Also understanding the strengths is really important, and we need to balance both in order to get good policy and practice. But I did want to throw to Kelly now and just hear a little bit about, we've heard a lot about challenges, thinking about strengths and skills. And so Kelly, can you tell us your thoughts on how we can better recognise the valuable skills and insights that young carers gain from caring?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks so much for the opportunity as a former young carer to be part of this this forum to share so many insights into how researchers and other young carers can improve the landscape. I do think that it's a testament to Carers New South Wales Australia that we bring together these voices to speak about it. In terms of strengths, I think Owen touched upon it on his research. There are so many things like empathy, resilience that have really changed the way I myself look at the world and the care that I'm able to extend to other people. But I would also say there are other skills that I never could have dreamed learning at school or even in a tertiary setting, such as in such a fragmented healthcare system, the ability to problem solve and work out how to manage care is a skill that has now been able to inform my professional life, working in patient advocacy and helping people navigate a system that can often be very daunting. I think the statistics on health literacy are already very challenging in our country, and to be able to have young people who experience it firsthand, who grow up with it, who often don't know any different, can then take this back to the community and bring it back to people and use their experiences to inform how we care for people across the spectrum of life.
Brilliantly put, thank you, Kelly. And it makes me think as well, I wasn't going to mention this, but something that we've been working on in an employment, we've done some employment projects with carers, including one that was specifically working with young carers around their skills and raising awareness of that in an employment context. It really has just drawn out the extent of skills that all carers, but including young carers, really have. And we recently actually launched a tool, I guess, to help carers think that through. And so that may also be of interest to some people. I'll post that link in the chat. But one of the ones that definitely comes up, we talk to a lot of carers in developing this tool, which I've just shared in the chat then. And one of the things that people say is very transferable to their professional career is that complexity of navigation. And it's also something that comes up a lot when we talk to carers about the challenges of caring and what support they need. That administrative complexity, service navigation, comes at the top again and again and again, and it is a really valuable skill. So thank you for shouting that out as well. And did any of our other panelists want to comment on that sort of skills and strengths angle? Go for it, Ben.
Just to jump in, just to give a bit of a context for sort of international education policy and where things are going. Many of the sort of leading international education policy groups like the OECD are very much emphasizing these sort of 21st century skills, soft skills of things like empathy, flexibility, resilience, conscientiousness, all the things that is needed when young people are caring for someone. So I think Kelly's just, what she was talking about there really highlights that there are many of these sort of soft skills that are refined and built on just through the caring role as a natural function of the caring role that aren't well recognized by the education system, but are really important for people's lifelong learning, but also success as an adult as they're navigating, the world around them and also supporting other people.
Thanks, Ben. And there's definitely opportunities, I think, more and more in the policy and practice space to have those skills recognised. So that's something I know we're working on, and a number of our panellists have been working on that as well. So yeah, it's really important to consider that as well. And the other question I wanted to ask you, Kelly, drawing on your experience, is we're talking a lot about research today and research that includes young carers and raises the experience of young carers, as well as how that can inform policy. How can research and policy better include young carers in those processes?
Yeah, sure. I think speaking back to Myra's comment about very small tweaks that can be made to complement the experience of young carers. I know for myself, when we had friends who before an exam you'd need to put a phone away, everyone was busy looking up last minute questions to try and make sure they could get the best mark. And all I could think about was, how am I going to leave my phone for an hour and a half? What if something happens? So just being cognizant of the fact that the experience of schooling or education or even early work is not the experience of other young people, and that there are things that can be put in place. Just a simple, are you okay? Do you need to do your exam in a separate room? Someone else can look after your phone so you're not using it, but you will have access if a family member needs anything, or you need to be somewhere, or you do get that call that this is the goodbye call. You've got the security knowing that the other adults in your life or the other authority figures in your life have your back. They understand that your whole life is not school, your whole life is not work, and that there is somebody at home who is depending on you to have their healthcare needs met and to navigate the system they want to navigate the way that they want to. So I do think there's that. And I do think, similar to what Carers New South Wales Australia is doing today, is actually bringing in the voices of young carers, which has been done so beautifully with Owen's research and the other young carer who recorded earlier before, that these experiences are nuanced, but they do have a thread that tie them together, which is that we are prematurely in a position, often not by choice, of looking after someone. Many of us would never change that because we love our families, we love our friends, we love the people that we want to care for, and we do want to do it. We just need systems and supports in place that enable us to live the life at the age that we are, while also being able to be there to support the people that we love.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Kelly. Very articulately said. And on day one of our research incubator, that was our early career research forum, another shameless plug, that was really the focus of that session, was looking in depth at how, with our sort of emerging researchers in these spaces, how do you really include carers of all ages, including young carers, from the outset, and ensure that their voices are informing what you're doing, both around their diverse experiences, but also the wisdom that they bring, and the help that they can bring to interpretation and research design. So if anyone is kind of interested in digging into that, those recordings, but also some other work that the Carer Knowledge Exchange has been doing, really looks at that, carer involvement in research and partnering with carers. So I think it's great to have that as well. And we can all do better at that in all of our different pieces of work. So it just is a great example of why those voices are so important. And Ludmilla also had some thoughts, I think. Did you want to add anything about how we can better include young carers in research and policy making?
Sure, and those are really good points. And I was also going to touch on co-designing as well, like working with young carers as partners, not just collaborators, like starting your research from the framing of your research questions, just trying to focus on what's important for young carers. I think that's something that we all could do, we all could benefit from. And also respecting the autonomy of young people. So not trying to impose our own experiences on young carers. They are really mature. They learn so many skills that even me, as a 34-year-old, haven't learned yet. Just giving them the opportunity to continue on their caregiving roles if that's something that they want to, but just making sure that they are supported, and also giving them ways to find some respite if they need to.
That's great. Thanks, Ludmilla, for adding those thoughts. Did any of our other panelists want to add anything about that involvement opportunity?
If I could just, it's not so much about, consulting with young carers, but it's about collecting better data. I mean, I think if the school systems are going to improve the extent to which they meet young carers' needs in schools, they need to understand how many young carers are in their schools, and how the young carers' needs across the state vary, between different schools and different local health areas and so on. So I think if we're talking about policy making that better includes the experiences and needs of carers, the departments of education across the states and territories really need to do better in collecting data on prevalence of young carers in schools and the experiences and needs of young carers in schools.
And a bit of a shout out to our friends in the UK, where there is a school census that includes young carers. So there's a example that's very progressive around systematic collection of young carer data. There's definitely places that are doing it that we can look to. Did anyone else want to comment?
I will just say, Sarah, on that point, and throwing back to Lucy's research before and changing the questions, and also speaking to what Myra mentioned about collecting data, it is so important to make sure that the questions and the data collection is done in a way that resonates with young people. I know from my own experience as a carer for 12 years, I did not consider myself the primary carer, despite there being no next of kin or anybody else until my father actually passed away. And so having questions that are framed around, do you do these tasks? Do you pick up prescriptions? Do you answer the phone? Really, really makes a difference in data collection. Even if someone had said all of these things qualify you to be a young carer, I still would have said, but I'm not. I'm a young person. I go to school. I hang out with my friends. I'm not a carer. I don't identify as that at all. But when you look at it on paper and you ask those questions, really, that's the role that you're serving.
Absolutely. And that kind of function or task-based identification is something we've really found a lot from our engagement with young carers as well, and informed our advice to Lucy and others around how to frame those questions. And so if there are people as well today that are wanting to do that better in their services or in their educational settings, we are also happy as Carers New South Wales to help advise on that. Obviously, there's examples out there about how you can ask those questions too, but it really does change the identification, how you ask it. And yeah, no, absolutely. It's great to hear. Yeah, Ben's hands up.
Just a thought about Myra's call to arms, and acknowledging, Kelly, the complexity. There is a New South Wales survey that's run every year, the Tell Them From Me survey. There's potentially an opportunity there to advocate for a set of screening questions. So I think I have some interaction with the Centre for Education and Statistics at in the New South Wales Department. I think if we put something to them, they might consider it.
I love the live collaboration, and that's why we call this the Research Incubator, because we like to incubate ideas in our live discussions as well as with our participants. So it's a great suggestion, and hopefully we've got some education people joining as well. We've just had our famous video presenter Luke join the session in the chat. Thank you, Luke, for popping in. We've played your video and we're just wrapping up our questions, but thank you for joining us. It was great to have you kick off the session. That's kind of the end of our formal questions, but I guess I wanted to maybe end by giving everybody a bit of a last word. So if there's something that you haven't said already that you wanted to add, if there's something that is, I guess, just you want to reiterate as your kind of key thing to call to action, I might just sort of go to everybody individually and give you that opportunity. So let me think, who will I dob in first? Does anyone want to dob themselves in, or shall I pick someone? I'm going to dob in Lucy. What's your final point?
Yeah, look, I mean, I obviously talked quite a bit before about asking the right questions, and I loved, Kelly, that you picked up on that as well, and thought about your own experiences and how you might have been able to get into a question like that, whereas you mightn't have been able to get into an "Are you a carer?" question. But I think for us as well, what we and obviously we're, you know, in quite a unique position, but what we are really focusing on is not just stopping there, but then using that springboard, so using our improved identification to then explore further and build each year on what we can you know, learn about young carers in our program, but also, you know, what we can then be sharing back with other organisations, with Carers New South Wales, for example, supplementing other data collections that are going on out there, and really thinking about that jigsaw approach that we can all use so that we can fill in the gaps around young carers and you know, bring visibility to young carers as well.
Thank you, Lucy. Your last word, Myra.
Oh, my last word is that we've got a lot of research evidence about young carers now. Yeah, we know a lot about young carers' experiences and challenges, and to me, you know, the really focused, sustained effort now needs to be translating that in a way that affects change. And you know, we're not getting traction at the policy level in the way that we need to. And so, you know, I think looking forward, that would be a really great area of focus for young carer research.
Brilliant. I'm noticing a theme already. Ludmilla, what's your final comment?
I agree with Myra. We need to understand what works for young carers, and I think in order to understand that, we need to actively work to identify your young carers everywhere in every space that they may be in contact with any service of government. And this could be providing a framework of identification of carers in disability services, health services, a framework of identification for young carers for schools, for universities, because they are everywhere, but we are now working actively to identify them.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ludmilla. We'll go to Kelly next, and then Ben finally. Kelly, what's your final word?
Sure. My final word would just be to lean on your peak bodies, because I feel like the collaboration and the advocacy comes when we can come together in these forums, share our unique perspectives, and be a united voice to present to government to say, this is what we need. We've looked at it from the many angles, not just from lived experience, not just from research, not just from data, but from all of it connected. We can powerfully advocate for the same things and to really bring light to the plight of the young person caring and the money that it saves the economy having these people here supporting their loved ones.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kelly. Lucky last, Ben, what's your final word?
Two things, I guess. Young people caring. There's so many who are caring, and it's a very natural thing to do. And I think we need to think about it as something people want to do, and society really needs to think about how to support people to do that without any implication for their longer term outcomes. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, on the policy side of things, I think in terms of the higher education policy, the University as a Accord policy is really around focused around addressing inequity in educational provisioning. And there's a real opportunity to leverage policy agendas of this Labor government to benefit all. And I think there's real opportunities to do that more. So I would strong advocate looking for where the policy agendas align with the needs of young carers. So that's one that I think is really quite relevant.
Great. So really kind of strong, I guess, call to arms there, to borrow a phrase from someone earlier. What I heard from those wrap-up points is really we know enough to act, like we've got enough to move forward. And what we need to do is actively identify young carers more across the board so that we know what they need in their different settings, act on what we know, and improve policy and practice. And how we do that is working together with a common goal to achieve change. So I think it's a really exciting place to end. I know that in the years that we've been working in this space, there has been a lot of development in young carer research, hence the title of this session. So I think we're in a much better position than we were 5-10 years ago in terms of data collection, but also connecting up that data and analysis. And we do know a lot more definitively than we did. So I think it is a great place to sort of end our formal questions around where to next. We have had a couple of questions, well, a question and a comment come through the chat. I want to also give our audience the opportunity, if there's a question you would like to ask our panelists, please add it. The question that we had initially was actually for Lucy, a little bit more about the scope of your evaluation. So if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit more about that for our audience, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. The audience. So we have obviously mentoring programs that are in school. Our mentoring programs are sort of between 10 weeks to 6 months. The majority are 6 months, and we have obviously the opportunity, which is very which is an incredibly privileged opportunity to be collecting data at the beginning and at the end of our program, because we have such a lengthy program, and we can therefore collect a whole range of background characteristics about the program participants at the beginning, as well as a range of outcomes, and then ask those same outcomes at the end and look at the impact of the program on those outcomes. But it also means, as I was talking about before, that we can then start looking at the differential impact that our program might have, as well as the differential experiences that our program participants might have based on characteristics that they have. And so we can look at the impact of our program on young carers, for example, and we're able to do that as well because we have so many young people identifying as young carers in our program. But as a result of that, and something that we are able to do more and more now is follow those quite, surveys, which obviously get you to a particular point in your understanding, but also supplement that with qualitative research and do deep dive focus groups so we can identify, well, this program has a range of young carers in it. It might be a higher proportion, and we can therefore do a focus group in that program specifically about caring and hear from young carers, but also obviously hear from other young people who might be reflecting about caring and thinking about, about the questions themselves as well. As Ben was saying, it's a natural instinct of people to care for others, even if students are not young carers themselves. They're looking at supporting their friends. They're looking at how their friends are interacting at home and with their profile, so with their cohort. So we have a lot of evaluative work that we can do, and we also can do qualitative research, both designed to improve our program, but also to learn more about, the whole range of young people, because we're working with a group, 13 to 15-year-olds, who are hard to engage in research, and we're very lucky to be able to do that.
Thanks, Lucy. That's great. We also had a comment in the chat that wasn't so much a question, but I think lends itself to a question, which was regarding the mobile phone issue, which obviously came up a couple of times. So I'm not sure if you saw that there, but someone said that Carers ACT was able to advocate for a young carer exemption for the public school mobile phone ban. We tried that too, probably weren't as successful, but it's a really great concrete example of something really specific and practical that can be done, as Myra had said, at that kind of grassroots level. So I guess I just wanted to, off the back of that, we had heard about that example. We heard as well, Ben, about some screening questions in the school survey. Is there anything else that any of the panelists can think of that's like, say, low-hanging fruit is not the term, but something that is like on a platter we could kind of ask for right now to improve the situation? Is there anything else people wanted to mention? Go for it, Ben.
I'll go. So I think this is probably true across the board, but I think careers counselling is pretty poor in Australia. And certainly in terms of careers counselling for young carers, I think it's fairly low level, and there's particular challenges for young carers as well. So if I was to ask for one thing, I think it would be some form of education program for careers counsellors, or whether or not it's a specific type of support that, say, Carers New South Wales provides for young people as they're making decisions about what they want to do after school.
It's a great idea, Ben, and we have a third or fourth grant application in at the moment trying to do that. We haven't had any success getting these projects funded, so if there's any funders out there that would like to fund that, we agree that would be a really great thing to do. But I should say that Carers New South Wales does offer young carer awareness training for service providers and educators, but also we have a module for career, not young carer specific, but career sector, career development sector. So if there's any educators or careers sector people online or watching the recording that would like to find out about that, please contact us, because we can offer and tailor those sessions in the meantime. Any other kind of specific things that lend themselves to immediate action?
I'd suggest you could, it would be good if at least in New South Wales, if schools were mandated to do Carers New South Wales excellent young carer awareness training. I think that would be a huge step. I also think greater access to financial support. I know there's the Young Carer Bursary. There's very little awareness of the Young Carer Bursary. that, you know, it was very like the application process is very complex, and young carers, certainly when I was looking more closely at the process, young carers were requiring a lot of support to apply. So that's another thing. The third is better recognition of young carers in the health system. I know there's some work going on in New South Wales in that space, but so that young carers feel like their expertise and voice are recognised appropriately in their encounters with the health system.
Great. Well, we also had a couple other questions in the chat come through, which is great. So we heard a little bit more about Lucy's project, and obviously we didn't have a lot of time to kind of go into the beginning to everybody's work, but we have had a question, Myra, about the data that you talked about. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Sure. So that it was some time ago now. It was about 2014, I think it was. We conducted a national school-based survey of young people aged 9 to 14 years, and it was a wellbeing focused survey. It wasn't a survey about academic performance. It was about school engagement, wellbeing, social connectedness, and so on in the school environment. And so we felt, and so in that survey, we put in a couple of questions about whether or not young people were living with someone with a disability or chronic illness. So as Ben said, you know, it's quite a good indicator of kind of potential young care. And we also included questions about whether people carried out extra tasks, support and care tasks around the home because of a family member with a disability or a chronic illness. And so we felt like it was a really nice opportunity, first of all, to have data that was driven by children. It was in a school-based context. And it gave us a lot of insight into young carers' experience. Interestingly, in that project, we found that particular groups of young carers were doing worse than other young carers. So often we talk about young carers as in terms of outcomes across the whole cohort, but we found quite a bit of variation within the cohort of young carers. So, for example, young carers of a family member with a mental illness or drug and alcohol dependence had worse outcomes when it came to school engagement than other young carers. And in fact, young carers of a family member with a disability were much closer to non-carers on a number of the measures that we looked at.
Thanks, Myra. We also had another question, which is for any panelist. Could anyone speak to the pros and cons of having a more expansive or inclusive definition of what is considered care and who counts as a carer, e.g. language brokering as a care practice, but not necessarily for someone with illness, disability or addiction? Ben, jump in, yep.
Yeah, so I guess there's a challenge, I think, with being too inclusive. So because I think it's a natural human experience and want to be able to care for someone. It depends on the purposes of what you're asking for. So are you asking for with the view of providing additional support services and support and information? So government is very much thinking about how much am I going to have to pay for this? Who's responsible? You know, and that's really about service provisioning and resourcing, and that will depend on the intensity of the caring, and that's very hard to measure. So I guess I think there's this sort of challenge about awareness raising, information provision, which I think you can have a much more inclusive definition. And then when it comes to, you know, provisioning of things like the carer bursary, Myra, for example, which is sort of cold hard cash, then government's going to want to, I'm just talking about the policy challenges here more than anything, government's going to want to restrict access. And the question is that legitimate or not? Or to what degree is it legitimate? What's the threshold in terms of need? And so I feel like one of the things that we probably haven't, I'm not sure whether we've done this well enough, is really to identify young carers who really, really need additional support versus those who are doing okay, pretty well. Might need a few extra things, but not intensive support. So I feel like there's probably some additional work that's needed in the definition space around, well, when do we use this definition versus another? Because I think the reality is that it's probably a large number of young people who are young carer of someone or another, particularly when we're talking about mental health issues of the level in their peer group that we're talking about. So we need to think carefully about, from an advocacy point of view, but also thinking carefully about, who we're going to provide supports for in terms of how we define young caring. And I'm not sure, perhaps Myra's done this, other people have done this more, but I'm not sure that there's a specific sort of policy practice piece around, well, okay, if you fall into this threshold, what does that mean?
Does anyone else want to add anything? I guess to add from our perspective as well, it speaks to a broader conversation around the definition of care, not just in the young people context, but which has been happening particularly in the last couple of years around the National Carer Strategy, but also the inquiry into care recognition and looking at the federal care recognition legislation. So I think there's lots of different views on what care should and shouldn't include, but I guess if anyone's looking for a kind of yardstick at present in the Australian context, it would be to look at the Commonwealth Care Recognition Act and the state and territory equivalents of that legislation, which do define care in a specific way, sort of for, I guess, service eligibility and things like that. So it does vary a little bit, but certainly I think, as like Lucy was saying before, we've had a really restrictive definition that's been like, say, aging and disability, primary care. And I think we're broadening that out in terms of statistics and other things to look at, friends, for example, and also secondary care. So with Carer Gateway, for example, which is a national carer service system, young carers can get support through Carer Gateway. And often the young carers seeking support are not the only carer, they're not the primary carer. So I think there's definitely kind of a broadening definition for eligibility reasons. But yeah, I think the other area we need to be careful with is not diluting it too much, like you said, Ben. So I think that's a broader conversation, probably for another webinar, but it's a great question. And I think that's all of the questions that we have received from our audience, but there's some really great thought-provoking stuff there. I also just wanted to, so the things that have come up, we mentioned the Young Carer Hub before. A lot of the things that I mentioned, Young Carer Bursary, that kind of thing, there's information there. But people joining today may also be interested in the Young Carer Awareness Training that I mentioned, which I've just put in the chat. And also we have something that is part of the New South Wales Carer Strategy that Carers New South Wales leads, called the Young Carer Inclusion Network, that meets a few times a year and has a sort of a newsletter. So if you're a policy or practice person that really wants to be a champion in your workplace or sector and learn more and get more resources about how to do young care identification better, we really encourage you to join that growing group. We bring presentations on different topics and we workshop resources. And in the next 6 months, so the next meeting of that group will be in September, where we'll be looking at some initial work around a stakeholder information kit, particularly for educators around young carer referral and that sort of thing. So just some thoughts for people that want to kind of take action based on today's conversation. So I think, look, we could keep talking forever, but there's some really great concrete ideas. I think hopefully our audience has had some food for thought around what we know about young carers. So there's many things we probably don't need to ask anymore. We know enough and we can continue. There's some things we still need to ask so that we understand the nuanced and diverse needs of young carers, but really the onus now is on action. There's a lot of data and evidence, and we know what needs to change. So it's really about collaborating to ensure that those things change so we can see some uplift in these outcomes for young carers. So we'll kind of, I guess, wrap up on that stirring note, and it's a great way to end not only this session, but also the Research Incubator for 2025. I want to thank again our wonderful panelists, including those that are not here live, Luke and Owen, but everyone that's contributed to the design of this session, also to Kiara, who helped us devise this session as well, and to all of the young carers that have participated in all of our research to give us these insights as well. As I mentioned, this is the last session of 2025 Research Incubator, but the Care Knowledge Exchange runs lots of events and has a number of different ways that you can connect. So please do ensure that you're subscribed to the Care Knowledge Exchange monthly email updates. We'll also share information about that when we circulate the recordings, which we'll share with all registered participants of any of our sessions. Don't forget to check out some of the other links that have been in the chat, the Young Carer Hub. Please do consider what action you can take in better identifying and supporting young carers. Let us know what you do about that and if we can help. And lastly, we just want to revisit as well that you know, caring can come with many strengths, but also discussing some of the very real challenges can be distressing. So if you are a carer and you need more support, whether you're a young carer or not so young carer, please do prioritise care for yourself. Take a moment, sort of some space after hearing the evidence we've talked about today, but also please do reach out for support. Carer Gateway is mentioned there. There's other supports for carers, and I think that information has just been shared in the chat as well. We will sort of formally close the session, and thank you again to all of our panelists for their time. We will share key links with registered participants after, and if you'd like to get in touch or have any further questions, please let us know. You'll be able to see contact details in the materials that we send to you. So take care, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you for participating in this year's Care Knowledge Exchange Research Incubator.